Welcome, everybody. Yeah, I'm Tom Allen, one of the co-organizers with Dr. Hoffman and Yusuf. And today we've got a colleague from University of Southern Mississippi, Patrick Biber. Patrick is working with me, finishing up an NSF grant studying marshes and sea level rise, and we thought it would be a great cross-fertilization to have him come and share some of his broader research with us in Hampton Roads. Patrick is associate professor in the Department of Coastal Science at USM. He's also established a Center for Plant Restoration and Coastal Plant Research, CPR, which I love the acronym. He's done a lot of work on artificial reefs and living shoreline projects and a lot of coastal adaptation type of work, as well as coastal ecology generally that we have here, and even some work on the production of native plants for coastal restoration projects. So with that, we will have time at the end, and I'll let Patrick take it away.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks everybody for joining. I'm excited to be here and happy to share something that's maybe a little bit more at the slower time scales of years to decades and larger geographic regions. So when I Googled to get a title slide image and said coastal vegetation, it gave me this lovely shot of a meadow of dune plants along a sandy beach environment. And that's not what I'm going to talk about. So this is the last picture you'll see of sand dunes and pretty flowers. Just a quick background and some information about where I am and how I got here. I am on the Mississippi Gulf Coast in Ocean Springs, where the Division of Coastal Sciences, which is part of the School of Ocean Science and Engineering, and the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Southern Mississippi is located. As the title of the school implies, we have a wide range of disciplines, including folks that love to play with UAVs and do deep sea research on our larger vessels. I'm the guy that plays in the mud with the plants and then likes to stick close to the shoreline. And as you may hear from my accent over time, is I am an immigrant to the US and grew up in far northern Australia, in an area that has very low population density, however, has a long history of manipulation by the indigenous Aborigines and trade with the Indonesian islands for marine products going back many thousands of years. So my formative years really looked at coastal systems that are quite different in appearance and probably function to the ones that we typically see in the United States. Some career milestones. I got my Bachelor of Science in Zoology and Marine Biology in 1993, a PhD in Marine Biology and Fisheries in 2002 in South Florida, did a postdoc in Morehead City and at the Beaufort Lab, NOAA Lab in North Carolina for a couple of years before starting the tenure track position at Southern Miss in coastal Mississippi. So I've seen a few different environments and habitats in the southeastern region and have mostly focused on vegetation, even though my degrees are more heavily in the faunal side of coastal ecology. Some just generic things that I've worked on over the years, mostly started in seaweeds, moved on to seagrasses and how we can use them to think about changes in coastal systems, including water quality, and then transition to more marsh-based and tidally emergent plants, thinking about sea level rise, sediment budgets, but also thinking about restoration, nursery production, and things that go along with that. Have worked on oil spills, both here as well as in Florida, and also some things like beneficial use of dredge spoil and living shorelines. So have explored quite a few different topics. The main organisms of interest have been seaweeds early on, seagrasses throughout the last 20 years, and then salt marshes as a third habitat type. And this image is from the Chandeleur Islands, which is a little south of Mississippi, but captures all three types of plants that will be found in this sort of shallow intertidal coastal habitat. So a quick overview of the things that I'll share during the seminar. Spend a little bit talking about what plants and where are they found in the coastal system and what are they telling us. and then do 3 case studies. The first will be thinking about how seagrasses in especially the Mississippi Sound have told us about change over decadal timescales. And then 2 studies on marshes, one related to sea level rise and one related to more thinking about how restoration is working and whether it is giving us the success we hope. And then finalize with some concluding thoughts and a summary. So if we think of a coastline, this might be a typical example, especially from the West Coast or even portions of Eastern Australia. We have these various landforms, including maybe some coastal rise and some hills in the background. In the foreground, we have this river-dominated estuarine system that is emptying out into the coastal environment with some sort of sandy beach, bar-built type estuarine barrier. In the foreground, we have the sandy beach, and vegetation shows up on the sand dunes. Behind that, we have these marsh wetland habitats, which are much more low energy, depositional, fine sediments, and dominated by various salt marsh, brackish marsh, or fresh marsh, depending on where we are in the salinity continuum. In the water, especially in the saltier end members of the estuary, we have these submerged plants that are seagrasses that are doing many of the same things that the salt marsh plants are doing on land and in the intertidal. And then offshore, especially with hard bottom, we may have seaweed-dominated areas, kelps in temperate waters, and then other seaweeds associated with coral reefs and tropical hard bottom in more tropical environments. So we have a variety of different plant-dominated habitats, and I'll explore a couple of these throughout this seminar. Plants are static. They don't move around like animals do, and so they have to integrate and deal with changing environmental conditions. Sort of typical ones we often think of in terms of plant productivity is light required for photosynthesis, for terrestrial plants having sufficient water, and then sediments for the roots to grow in. Some other parameters that we often think about when we think about the ecology and production side of plants are access to nutrients, temperature, which influences growth rates. In estuarine and coastal systems, salinity is often a stressor or a variable that might influence productivity. And then herbivory or grazing might also be an important environmental factor that alters what that habitat looks like. We'll start off with seagrasses. This is one of the areas that I started off while I was doing my PhD in South Florida, and then did quite a bit of work on this during my postdoc, as well as for a number of years after I started here at USM. Seagrasses grow in shallow intertidal environments. They typically require more salty waters. There are other plants called submerged aquatic vegetation, which will grow in the lower salinity members of the estuarine continuum, but seagrasses are going to be downstream in the salty environment. Oftentimes, the sediments are muddy, organic rich, and a consequence of that is that they have relatively low or no oxygen, even in the area where the roots and rhizomes of these plants are trying to grow. And so one of the challenges that seagrasses and salt marsh plants face is keeping those roots and rhizomes supplied with oxygen for respiration. Turns out that light is a very important environmental factor because of the need to have a lot of photosynthesis to support these below-ground structures. And variables that can influence the amount of light available for seagrass leaves include epiphytes and algal overgrowth, but also suspended particles or turbidity in the water column. Growth, much like in marsh plants, is this underground root rhizome system and clonal vegetation and expansion that is the typical form of growth that we find in many of our seagrass species. Sexual reproduction is less common in many of them. And because they are underwater plants, they have evolved these very interesting and unique pollination methods, including mucus strings that have the pollen granules embedded in them, and then they fertilize the female flower. The seeds are often optimized for fairly short distance water dispersal. So again, sexual reproduction in many seagrass species is not really a huge dispersal mechanism. So they can be quite vulnerable to local change. And we often consider seagrasses as important habitats because that's where we find a lot of organisms. So nursery habitat, much like salt marshes. Primary producer base, turns out that maybe the algae and the diatoms growing on the seagrass blades are a little bit more important in terms of the actual food resource rather than the seagrass plants themselves. Because they have roots, they are trapping the sediment, stopping some of that resuspension, but the leaves waving in the water column are also reducing wave and current velocities and promoting a depositional environment. And so much like salt marshes, they are important for protecting coastlines. And in the sediments in particular, there are often important carbon and nitrogen cycling processes going on. For this reason, seagrasses have been considered as indicators of good estuarine ecosystem health, and loss of seagrasses suggests that there's a problem. Oftentimes it's related to water quality, and a lot of times it's nutrient enrichment of the water quality. So this was one of my first field trips when I started down here in December of 2004. Went out to the Chandeleur Islands. This is a very low tide in early December, and we can see the 5 different genera of seagrasses found out there. These are typical of the Caribbean flora, and so we are on the northern edge of the distribution of many of these species, with the exception of Haliduli and Rupia, which do grow further north into North Carolina and beyond. And not too long after I arrived here, we had an event called Hurricane Katrina. So we piggybacked on some research that had been done about a decade earlier here at GCRL, looking at seagrasses out at the Chandeleur Islands. And in particular, we chose the 6 study locations where there was some historical data on various parameters, including percent cover. And in the background of those 6 pink points, you can see how much the island changed in response to these 3 tropical storm events. And in particular, the beach facing the eastern side of the island has experienced quite a bit of erosion. There's been 2 renourishment projects since 2010 to bring that beach back. And so these transects, there's a southern transect from inshore to offshore and a northern transect from inshore to offshore. And these are the quadrat-based percent cover results. The ones on the left are that southern transect going from inshore to offshore, and the ones on the right are that northern transect, also going from inshore to offshore. And this spans about 15 years or so in time. And you can see that there's not really an obvious story, maybe with the exception of LO4, which was a deep water site further offshore, and we only found plants there one time. So not exactly a great, exciting story to publish. But it's part of a larger story of seagrasses are changing, and in many coastal systems, including this image from Tampa Bay, have been reducing or disappearing over time. If we go back and look at some of these older historical aerial photographs, as well as other field reports, seagrasses used to be quite abundant in the near shore. And over the last 40, 50 years, especially into the early 2000s, in many areas there have been reports of substantial decline, suggesting these estuarine and coastal systems are experiencing substantive change. Maybe on the land, it could be this development here that we're seeing close to shore and attendant changes in what's coming into the watershed. And so one way to think about measuring that change is to step back and start thinking about mapping. And that's quite an interesting story in and of itself. Some of the earlier maps in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, when a lot of us were cutting our teeth on GIS, polygons were drawn much like this. A big area and some descriptor of the habitat within that area. Continuous, dense, patchy, sparse, which is useful, but gets you into problems like this when you have more recent technologies where you can use pixel-based or individual-based type classification. And so here we're looking at the 1990 polygon, 1999 polygon in dark green, and the 2004 coverage in orange. And you can imagine doing a change analysis and saying, wow, we've lost 90% of the area of seagrass in only 5 years. Well, that's partly a function of the mapping and not necessarily a reflection of reality. And this is absolutely the story that came out of Mississippi and it's absolutely not correct. So this is a PhD student study, the first case study, thinking about going back and redoing these maps and going with polygon-based mapping over a longer time series. Some of the earliest reports for seagrasses in the Mississippi Sound region come from a report in 1973, sort of a post-Camille report. And the main take home here of the map at the bottom is seagrasses are on the northern side of these islands for the most part. They're protected from the open waters of the Gulf, and the amount of island and the extent of the island largely dictates where seagrasses are going to be found. So many different studies done by many different people for many different reasons, and I tasked my student with sort of putting all that together. This map shows a pretty good summary of the main take-home message. The project went back to look at some of the early historical survey grade, modern day accurate and has sufficient spatial resolution that it can be used for photo interpretation, which was 1940 at these two islands, Horn Island and Pettyboy Island. The bounding boxes of latitude and longitude are identical on the left and the right. So it's exactly the same area. And it's clear in the early image that the islands extended much further to the east than they do in the present day. Longshore transport of the sediment basically erodes the islands on the east and deposits that sediment on the west. The other thing that's fairly obvious is the amount of red, which is the seagrass area. It's much less in the 2007 image, even accounting for the reduction in island size than in the 1940 image. This is a table of many different islands and some places along the mainland. And if you go down a column, you can see that there are widely varying numbers of acres of seagrasses reported depending on who did the mapping, how they drew the polygons, and what their interpretation was. And largely we kind of came up with two categories. There were people that drew big polygons and said anywhere in this polygon there's potentially seagrass, and we don't really care exactly how much there is. We just kind of care about this potential seagrass area. Those are some of those big numbers in bold. And then the numbers that we calculated might be more reflective of the actually vegetated pixels in the water on the image. And so we called that the vegetated seagrass area. And those numbers were much smaller. One of the things we did find was that there was a decline, especially through the 70s and 80s, and then some recovery and some high points and some low points. I'm using Horn Island as an example. We suspect that a lot of the decline in the 70s and 80s was actually due to fairly frequent shrimp trawling. And as you know, those trawls tend to rip up the bottom. And so, 2 or 3 trawls a day in some of these seagrass beds, it probably didn't take very much to uproot a lot of the vegetation and cause quite a dramatic change. In the late 80s, the Gulf Islands National Seashore was formed, and they have a 1-mile buffer around the shoreline of the island. So all of the seagrass is protected, including from fishing activities that are commercial, no dredging and no trawling is allowed. And that's allowed those habitats to recover. Here's a good map showing sort of this change. The island shoreline is in the pale pink color from 2007. So you can see, especially for Horn and Pettyboy, how much of the island has migrated. And that's all red, showing that that's been loss of seagrass over that time period. Green is areas that were pretty much were new areas that were added to in the later image compared to the early image. Black are areas that were pretty much consistent in the earliest and the latest images. And then red is the areas that were lost. And there's 2 main takeaways on the loss. If the island's not there, it was lost. And if it was a little further offshore in deeper areas, we tended to have more substantial loss in those areas as well. Another way to look at this was a hotspot analysis. So we made some assumptions here saying that larger patches that are more stable over time are indicative of better or more valuable habitat in terms of organisms that might use it as a nursery. And so the red areas here are areas which are more stable, have better habitat value. The blue areas, conversely, would be areas where there's been more frequent change, more small patches. Those patches tended to move around more frequently. And so that may be a less stable and less valuable habitat. And so you can see there are these hotspots or clusters on each of the islands where there may be better habitat and other cold spots where there may be less persistent habitat. And this is available through a website here, including some of the publications that came out of this. So if you go back and look at the recording, you can go and get a bit more details on this. Following up on that, some of you may be familiar with the Status and Trends projects. The most commonly cited one is the report on the right from 2007 through USGS. But there has been an update in 2020, and I'm helping to work on an update for 2030 throughout the Gulf of Mexico, looking at a way of commonly reporting and thinking carefully about these mapping issues to get a better handle on change analysis of seagrasses throughout the Gulf. So some take-home things that I learned from this case study is change over longer time periods usually is going to rely on some kind of mapping product and maybe less so on those quadrat-based data sets. But maps are made by different people using different protocols and different priorities and different decision criteria. So delineation of what's inside and outside the polygon can look quite different depending on how it was done, which means area does not always represent the same thing. And when assimilating other people's maps, that's probably an important consideration, especially if you're trying to use those areas calculated from those different maps to ascribe that there has been habitat change in either a positive or negative direction. So we're going to migrate to the intertidal and focus on two case studies on salt marshes. Salt marsh environments are not that different from seagrass environments other than the plants are growing in the shallow intertidal, so they're exposed to air. Many of the other parameters are fairly similar. Because these plants are growing in air, they do need to conserve water, which is not something that an aquatic plant needs to do. And so organic osmolytes and salt tolerance adaptations become very important features of describing which plants are found where in the salt marsh habitat. In addition, because they are intertidal, especially storm surge, physical damage, and even rack being deposited up and covering the leaves is a different source of stressor. Pollination is generally windborne, and seeds are maybe a bit more optimized for further dispersal distance than they are for seagrasses. So case study 2 was a project funded through the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Math through their Gulf Research Program. And the question that we set out to look at was, again, sort of this long time series going back in time and projecting forward in time and thinking about how our coastal marshes here, using Mississippi as an example, may be going to change in response to sea level rise that's already occurred, but also future sea level rise. In our area, sea level is rising at rates not that dissimilar from the Norfolk area, around 4 millimeters per year now. It is quite a bit higher in the Mississippi River Delta and Louisiana, and projections suggest that we might expect as much as 1 foot of sea level rise within the next 25 years by 2050. This is what that would look like, the projected high tide line with that 1 foot sea level rise by 2050. Notice this would not necessarily be continuously inundated, but where the high tide would extend to. And this is pretty much where a lot of our coastal marsh environments indeed exist today. So we would expect maybe a little bit of edge erosion, maybe some interior subsidence, maybe some shift northwards of the salt marsh and brackish marsh delineation into more fresh marsh areas. So this research project explored various different methods of detecting long-term trends of both historical marsh change, a little bit about the condition of the marsh or the health, and then thinking about some models to project that forward into the future. And the RFP was asking for innovative ideas to advance understanding of multiple different parameters related to coastal ecosystem, but also coastal human community vulnerability and risk. We broke it down into 4 tasks to get at the overall objective of long-term change. The first task was historical image analysis and what changes happened to date from the past to today. Thinking about fragmentation, analogous to thinking about those valuable areas of seagrass that are larger and more persistent versus those areas that were undergoing more rapid change, doing something similar in the marsh areas. Biophysical model to think about vegetation condition, specifically looking at chlorophyll and a couple of other remote sensing indicators. And then developing a model to project future change. And we can also think a bit about the different technologies and the different sources of data that go into such a long time analysis, including black and white historical photography from aircraft, color infrared, satellite, both historic and more recent, and just spatial scale resolution of area, but also resolution of spectral information with those different types of data sets. So a quick summary of the research findings from each one of the tasks. Task 1 was that historic to present day, and the general finding was that marsh loss has exceeded marsh gain since the 1950s in our area. I don't think that's a big surprise. Increased vulnerability of marsh loss once patches get smaller, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. We were able to use these remote sensing biophysical models to look at some different stressors, notably hurricane, but also drought stress. And generally, the model that we developed was similar to the prediction that we saw earlier, where most of these marsh areas would be fairly resilient to emerging sea level rise. But after 2050 and certainly after 2070, the rate of loss picks up quite dramatically. So some images to show you for each of the tasks. Here is the Grand Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve, marsh loss from 1955 to 2014 in red, and marsh gain in green. And we can see most of the loss here is along the edge erosion and inland migration. And marsh gain tends to be in sort of these upper marsh transition into terrestrial habitat areas. Here's a zoom in from the Pascagoula River study site. So this is a much more sediment-rich riverine delta. And again, a very similar story of mostly edge erosion, in some areas quite rapid edge erosion. And one of the interesting findings was that we did sort of see a progression of the different marsh categories moving inshore or up the estuarine gradient, but we also found that the cypress trees actually expanded a little further south. So some unexpected findings in that system. Task 2 was thinking about this fragmentation and shoreline erosion and some typical frag stats metrics that you could extract out of these types of maps. So on the bottom, we have a marsh that's mostly marsh and a little bit of open water. We start to get some edge erosion and inundation as sea level rises. At 50%, we're sort of half open water, half marsh. And then with sea level rise and the continued erosion, progression to more open water and less salt marsh habitat. And so total area would be declining fairly linear across those 4 example icons or cartoons. The number of patches, however, has a non-linear response. So initially, we have very few patches. It's one big patch. As this transition occurs, we get more fragmentation. We maybe get some isolated, fairly large patches. Those patches decline. And then as the progression continues, we start to lose marsh and we have fewer patches. Total edge or perimeter of those patches also would have a similar non-linear response. And somewhere in that mid portion of the change, maybe around 50% or so, we're going to have the largest amount of edge, And as we start losing those patches, that emergent land, we're going to start to lose the amount of edge. So some very interesting thoughts in terms of habitat usage of organisms that might be queuing more to marsh edge versus more to marsh interior. The biophysical model, these are polygons from satellite imagery that have been ascribed different values. Here's canopy chlorophyll, so essentially how green each pixel looks at that time point. Here is a conversion into standing stock biomass with greener colors indicating more dense and taller vegetation, and redder colors less dense or sparser vegetation. If you take all of these individual images and tie them together, we have canopy chlorophyll in the top panel, green biomass in the bottom panel, and we can see the seasonal change in the canopy greenness, and maybe also the standing stock biomass here, especially of things that senesce in the winter and regrow in the summer. And this first red box is the shoulder after Katrina. So not only did we have physical damage and salt stress, but we also had a fairly long period where we had very minimal rainfall. And so this is a combination stressor here, and we can see quite a sharp decline in both the amount of canopy chlorophyll and the associated green biomass extracted from these images. And this 2011 image would be a drought summer year, showing again a reduction in chlorophyll and standing stock biomass because of water stress. And the final one here on the right, we can see our projections moving forward of how marsh erosion and subsidence is going to contribute to the loss of that marsh edge, but also the fragmentation of these larger individual islands into much smaller little sub-islands before they completely disappear. And if we look at the timeline here, so for 2050, we have a more gradual decline. And as the rate of sea level rise increases, the rate of that decline goes up. So to get a 50% loss by 2050, we would need an annual sea level rise rate of around 12 millimeters per year, which is quite a bit higher than what we're likely to see in Mississippi. But to get that same 50% decline by 2100, we would need to have an annual sea level rise rate of only about 7.5 millimeters per year, which is certainly within the realm of what we're likely to experience moving forward. So we're fairly confident with this idea that these maps on the right are a pretty good representation of sea level rise related marsh loss, especially under these more elevated sea level rise rates that we're likely to see with the lack of climate action. We can summarize this case two with a couple of cartoons. So in the upper panels, panel A and B, we have a marsh that is fairly sustainable into the future with sea level rise. We have a fair amount of sediment input from terrestrial sources, especially in these more riverine dominated marshes. This allows that marsh elevation and that marsh platform to keep up with sea level rise and the loss due to erosion. With less sediment input, maybe the example of Grand Bay, we don't have enough sediment to really keep up with the rates of erosion, and so we start to lose the marsh platform, especially on the seaward edge, and we see these fairly rapid erosion rates from the seaward side. Thinking about the coastal squeeze element, a lot of our coastlines have buildings, roads, and other hard structure on them. And so once we have that element, as long as we have adequate sediment input, either through natural processes or sediment augmentation in the form of restoration, we can kind of keep that marsh keeping pace, that marsh platform keeping pace with the increased sea level rise, even though we may have a bit more energy and erosion. We may also do a shoreline protection like a living shoreline, but the marsh can't migrate upslope, so it's inhibited from moving upslope, unlike the condition in panel A. The biggest problem and the biggest challenge are going to be those marshes that are squeezed between an increasing sea level and don't have enough material to be able to keep pace with the rate of sea level rise, but also don't have anywhere to go and can't migrate upslope. So that would be the least sustainable option. And so one of the things to think about in terms of coastal squeeze is sort of that natural historical response to changes in sea levels where marshes migrate upslope as sea level rises and migrate downslope during periods where sea level is static or declining. And it's important to realize that many of our marsh areas and our estuaries are relatively recent. Most of these extensive marsh platforms formed over the last 10,000 or so years after the last ice age. And so we're sort of seeing a response of a more rapidly increasing sea level rise. And typically marshes would want to migrate upslope in these migration corridors. One of the projects that's underway now and throughout the Gulf through the Nature Conservancy is to identify areas of marsh loss, but also potential areas of marsh migration where there is low-lying, fairly gradual slope that isn't developed for marshes to migrate into. Some observations in our area about marsh migration. It was not uncommon in the 1950s, 1970s, and even 1990s imagery and field study photographs to have extensive salt pans. These are in the upper marsh. These are areas where during high tide or storm surge events, the salt water inundates the marsh, the water evaporates, the salt is left behind, and the sediment gets quite salty. There are these characteristic salt pan vegetation, including succulent species, that are well adapted to dealing with this higher salt content. But we're increasingly seeing these salt pans get replaced by our mid-marsh species, black needlerush, juncus, in a lot of areas, and these salt pans are fairly rapidly disappearing over the last decade and a half. And to me, this strongly suggests that we are sort of pushing our marsh zones upslope, and we are changing the inundation regime where these former salt pans are now inundated on a much more regular basis because that whole tidal prism has moved upslope. Another common observation that we see is Spartina patens, salt marsh hay growing in our slash pine forest, our coastal forests. Extensive areas in Grand Bay that now have this high marsh plant that is essentially growing in the understory of the forest. And it's maybe an early indicator of a future condition of ghost forest as saline intrusion continues to progress and starts to kill off some of the still living pine trees in that area. Not only are these gradual changes, but we also have these episodic changes. So this is an image a couple of days after Hurricane Katrina, and these are extensive damage to houses in these coastal neighborhoods along the shoreline. And so we can have these potential episodic events that might open up space. Unfortunately, most of the roads and the former foundations of the buildings are still there. This is 21 years after Katrina. These neighborhoods that have not redeveloped largely because of insurance costs. And I kind of thought about these as maybe having a title called Ghost Neighborhoods. This would be expansion space, future marsh migration corridors, if we remove some of this built environment and allow those vegetation to move upslope. But we can also do active restoration. This particular small parcel had a house on it that was completed construction the month before Katrina, and the house ended up way back here in this dark area at the edge of the marsh in the forest transition. No rebuilding was done, and this was rewilded essentially and regraded a little bit so that it's more suitable for marsh plants to slowly grow upslope, and it's a small park area. So that's the upslope side of marshes as they move upslope. But the downslope side of marshes are also vulnerable. Very common phenomenon in our area are these cut banks, rapidly eroding shorelines. And at low tide, you can go out and find these peat deposits that have now emerged. There's one area where there's an oyster midden, maybe an actual oyster reef that is emerging out from underneath the marsh as that marsh is migrating inshore here at the lab and exposing some very large, almost dinner plate size oyster shells. So evidence of fairly rapid erosion and shoreline transgression. And one of the activities that has really started to kick off down here since the Deepwater Horizon settlement in 2015 is shoreline restoration enhancement to offset this loss of the marsh edge. So to create additional marsh or create additional protection in front of marshes to offset that rapidly eroding shoreline, and to try and bring back some of that lost marsh habitat. And so this gets us towards our third case study, thinking about, is restoration doing what we expect it to do? We're spending quite a lot of money, something like about 35 to 40% of this $20 billion will end up in mostly marsh restoration throughout the 5 Gulf states. Other funds are going to aquatic restoration like oyster reefs, coral reefs, fish stocks, and so on. And then there's a tourism-related component that has gone to things like building visitor centers and doing some things like that. One of the primary activities that Mississippi is focusing on is called beneficial use, or repurposing material that is dredged out of the navigational channels to create elevation suitable for salt marsh plants to grow. And this is a bit of an older statistic, but gets back at this idea that there's a lot of marsh restoration happening. So case study 3 is, let's go and look at an example of a couple of beneficial use reconstructed marshes that should be mostly dominated by juncus. And we'll look at them at 2 different time points, an older restored site and a newer restored site. And very adjacent to those is a natural marsh site, which you're looking at here, and compare those for a number of different metrics that we typically collect in a ecological assessment of marsh. So this is just to remind me that beneficial use is a common activity. A lot of times this is pumped up, and so it's very wet, and they have to pump it up to an elevation that's a little bit higher than what it's eventually going to settle into. In our area, they often create a sandy containment berm around this pumped material, because otherwise it would just erode out and wash straight away back out into the subtidal over a couple of tidal cycles. The case study location here is in coastal Mississippi between Biloxi and Ocean Springs, and it's this little green island here just off of the coast. It's maybe no surprise that a lot of the casinos are located right here, and so there's a coastal resiliency component to this. The area in particular that we are studying is this northern eastern part of the island, and we have 3 study locations. The more reddish orange color is the site that was restored first, about 15 years before this study was started. The yellower color is the newer restored cell that was about 2 to 3 years old at the time we started the assessment. And then the blue area is the natural marsh. Maybe I got those backwards. I can't quite see. Oh yeah, blue area is the natural marsh in the southern portion of the island. And so the 2 plant species that would typically expect to find would be Spartina alterniflora. It tends to grow at slightly lower elevation and closer to the water's edge. But then black needle rush Juncus romarianus, which is one of our most important and space dominant species throughout Mississippi, and typically the one that we'd expect to find in most of our coastal salt marshes. But observations over many years suggest that it hasn't really established at these 2 BU sites. I'm not going to go through the results for all of the different aspects that we studied, but I'll focus primarily on what the sediment and the vegetation told us, a little bit about the food web component, and then also think forward a little bit about the sea level rise vulnerability to this restored site. And so the take-home message that became really clear after even the first season of sampling was the below-ground sediments were very different. Both restored sites were quite a bit sandier. Even the muddy soils that were pumped up from the BU activities had much less organic material than the natural marsh site. So there was significantly higher sediment organic matter, significantly more sediment organic carbon in the natural marsh sediments than in either of the 2 restored sites, irrespective of how long they had been there. In addition to that, we found that the natural restored site also had substantially higher below ground root rhizome biomass than either of the two restored sites. Above ground green biomass, the living leaves were fairly similar. There were some seasonal differences, but they didn't matter too much. This propagated into different aspects of the food web. So these are the types of invertebrates that would graze on detritus and or algae that are associated with marsh habitat. In particular, here we have fiddler crab burrows. This is the younger, the older restored, and the natural marsh site. And we have a number of bivalves and gastropod mollusks here, where we can see that we have almost none in the restored site, and they are only present in the natural marsh site. So quite a different suite of organisms and abundance of organisms that might be translating plant-based material into food for higher trophic levels. This extended into the higher level bird fauna. These two species, the clapper-rails and seaside sparrows, are both obligate marsh birds. And in particular, clapper-rails are focusing heavily on fiddler crabs as their energy and food source when they're ready to lay their eggs. And so without fiddler crabs, there's really not enough food for them to be able to successfully reproduce. And we can see that there are far fewer clapper-rails detected in either of the two restored sites compared to the natural marsh. Seaside sparrows are a little bit more moving around and forage a little bit more widely. And so we can see that the story there was a little less clear, but still more abundance in the natural site by and large. If we look at a stable isotope plot with carbon and nitrogen as the two axes, our primary producers are in gray. Remember, Spartina is a C4 plant, so it'll be over here by itself versus the other two, which are C3 primary producers. And the story wasn't quite as clear-cut as we might have imagined. It turned out that the natural marsh and the younger restored site were a little bit more similar in terms of their stable isotope composition than the older restored site. This may be in part because we did tend to focus in slightly higher, slightly above marsh elevations in some of our sampling, because that is where a lot of the area of the transect was located, and there was not as much low marsh. So our hypothesis of sort of a gradual increase in the function of the restored sites, with the younger site being more deporporate and less functional than the intermediate age, and that sort of moving towards the natural, didn't seem to hold true for the food web analysis as much as we were thinking. What about vulnerability to potential sea level rise? These are fairly low-lying sites. And so even at the lowest sea level rise projection in about 2070 or so, some of those low-lying areas were predicted to go underwater. At the higher sea level rise scenarios, that inundation could occur as early as 2040 to 2050. And so this is what it looks like in terms of a map. The warmer colors are higher elevation. The bluer colors are inundated sites. And maybe a little bit counter to what we expected, the natural marsh site is actually quite vulnerable. It's fairly low elevation and lower than some of the created habitat. Remember, they do tend to pump it up a little higher and expect it to settle out over time. So all of these sites are more vulnerable as the rate of sea level rise is more rapid here in Panel C. Some conclusions: the constructed sites weren't quite the same as the restored, as the natural site, even after 15 some years. And I was out there earlier this month, and again, the vegetation looks beautiful in terms of what you see above the ground, but the below ground story still is very much that the below ground sediments are very different. The amount of peat and organic material in the natural marsh is much higher, and that translates into quite different stories in terms of carbon and nitrogen cycling. And other studies in the area that have looked at this much more specifically suggest that it may take as much as 30 years for that carbon cycling to mimic the natural marsh area. So we're getting towards the end here. Some of the things that we learned in case study 3, Moving dirt is expensive, but it's necessary for doing this marsh creation. Planting or natural revegetation happens pretty quickly, on the order of a few years. Nice looking plants does not equal a functioning marsh. And especially these below ground sediment-based things may take a long time to return to comparable rates. And even food web type things are not necessarily moving at the rates you might expect. So what have we learned from these case studies? We often think of these sort of parameters in terms of plants and responding over fairly short time scales, but they are also indicative of these longer time scale type processes that we can measure through habitat change, but also thinking a little bit about how long does restoration take and how well is it going to help us with emerging sea level rise related issues. Some concluding thoughts. Plant-dominated habitats can inform coastal change processes. In particular, from the seagrasses, we can learn things about water quality, water clarity, and also vulnerability to landform change, like island erosion, for instance. Marshes can inform on climate, i.e. temperature, precipitation, as well as sea level rise and sediment transport related things. And coastal squeeze is an indicator of this type of process. Restoration may take longer than we think, especially for some of those more important biogeochemical processes and some of those food web linkages. And sea level rise may conflict with the ability of restoration to be successful. And largely collaborative and interdisciplinary research continues to inform coastal change and the implications to us as a society. So I think lots of different funding sources, lots of different institutions, lots of different people that contributed to these and other projects that I've worked on and have helped me learn more about coastal change and how coastal habitats and plants in particular can give us an insight into what's going on. If you're interested in learning a bit more, here is a website that I've set up, as well as my ORCID that you can use to access some of the publications arising from that research. So I think that's a good time for me to stop and allow everybody to start asking questions.